Well, hello, strangers. You've tuned in just in time. This is Neon Static, broadcasting true, scary stories you won't hear anywhere else. And I'm your host, Vi. And my toxic trait is that I shove the Q-tips all the way in. It's wrong, but it's so satisfying. This week, we have another story from childhood. It's Story 85, as told to me from an East Coast guy I served with. And it goes like this. This was back when I was 8 or 9. I lived with my parents in an older house outside of Baltimore, Maryland. It was a house that had been built sometime in the late 1800s. Due to its age, the house had those strange dimensions that instantly date a house to a long ago time period. All the doors were long and skinny. The hallways by turn would echo your voice or completely steal it away. It was the only place I ever lived in that I could be 2 feet away from my mom, facing her from the hallway, but she wouldn't hear me. But my dad, in the living room a room away, would immediately call out for me to quit yelling. There were these small built-in shelves and cubbies scattered about the house too. They were also in those weird, skinny tall dimensions. The floor creaked and squawked day and night. The house seemed to settle itself every 5 minutes, like a dog having a bad dream. Finally, throughout this house, the hallways and doors in and out of places were in the strangest spots. Having that many doorways made the rooms feel less like rooms and more like a house that had nothing but oddly shaped hallways. Any placement of furniture, a set of Queen Anne chairs and a small table, a coat stand or a hat rack, it didn't feel like it belonged anywhere. And frankly, neither did my family. Not in that house. My bedroom was separated from the living room by a pair of French doors. I didn't mind that. It let in light that the 2 small windows in the other wall didn't. At one end was my bed and dresser. At the other was my closet and a small alcove, another weird built-in space whose purpose maybe didn't exist anymore, like a coal room. My mom kept her ironing board in the alcove, along with a couple of other random things. The leaf from the dining room table we hauled out for Thanksgiving, a box of audio cassettes of songs she loved enough to have bought CDs of, but wasn't too sure this newfangled technology was there to stay. The room was huge compared to our last apartment, and that little alcove being filled up with random stuff comforted me, as, of course, upon moving in, I had discovered that the place felt strange for a reason. It was 100% absolutely haunted. The walls and floors settling at night drove me straight to my parents' room for weeks. The strange shadows from the outside windows, the odd echoey halls and tall ceilings. Every night, at some point, I'd awake with a cry, or come pelting down the hallway to my parents' room about something I'd heard, something I was sure I'd seen. My dad worked overnights, plant manager work, overseeing a factory floor that churned down producing machine parts 24/7. He worked there 5 nights a week, so it was my mom who bore the brunt of my nightly adventures. So they started punishing me for waking them. After a few rounds of this, I started finding other ways to cope with the fact that, to me, this was clearly a haunted house. I became an avid post-bedtime reader. I concealed myself and my flashlight under the covers to drag my eyes across pages until I was finally tired enough to pass out. This worked for a while, and things went on fairly normally. Winter break, my mom announced that she was going on a trip. My mom's parents were down in Florida. She told us that, the day after Christmas, she was going to fly down and see them for a week. My mom and my mom's parents had never been very close, unlike my father and his side of the family. My mom and dad talked about it more, and my mom was firm that this trip was just for her, and he agreed. When I asked him why we weren't all going together later that night, he told me that you only had so much time with older family to make things right. I didn't know what that meant. My mom and dad were mom and dad. I had the childlike understanding that they were never wrong. Thus, it was weird to think of my mom not having that same feeling about her parents. Maybe that's why she needed the trip. The day after Christmas, we left our house so early in the morning it was still full dark out. In deference to the early hour, my parents let me wear my PJs outside the house and into the cold, waiting car. My dad and I dropped my mom off at the airport. She gave me a hug and a quick kiss on the cheek, same as Dad, then slipped through the automatic doors and disappeared inside. My dad took us for donuts after. He even let me get my favorite, vanilla with pink frosting and nuts. It's one of those memories that I remember crystal clear about my dad. He wasn't there for a lot of my events, working overnights, sleeping during the day. But the clearest memories I have, for the most part, are him and I in some dingy strip mall having donuts. My mom's trip was long. It felt like forever in kid time. She was to be back before my school break ended, but I remember that for the first few days, my dad took me to school. When she did return, I hugged her and puppy-dogged her around the house. It was great having her back. My dad and I rattled around in the house, but with my mom, it felt lived in, fuller somehow. For a bit. By Valentine's, the house was again quieter, having grown around us. Even my mom's warm, loud presence wasn't filling it anymore. Dinners were solemn. The creaks and pops of old wood flooring settling and resettling got louder. Our little family of 3 seemed to spread out, with dead space between us. My parents started going to bed later, too. I remember a couple of times hearing them talking on the nights my dad didn't work. Their voices carried on some weird echo pocket down the hall to my room. They were too muted for me to make out words, but their tone told me everything. Whatever they were talking about, it wasn't good. I started having the same weird feelings at night again. I was reading longer and longer, and I was again feeling that the house was haunted. Something, besides my family, was moving around in it in the dark. One of those nights, I managed to slip into a light sleep, but was awoken by a new sound. Not a creak, not a pop. It was consistent. It took me a few seconds of waking up to realize it was a voice. A deep, low man's voice. It was different from my father's, but familiar somehow. It didn't sound angry, just low and steady. Still, I was scared enough to hide myself under my duvet, curling up and hoping that it would go away. It was harder to hear under the blanket, and my eyes were so heavy, I must have just drifted off. When I awoke, I did what my parents had always done and chalked it up to a one-time nightmare, a bad dream. I hoped it was a one-off, maybe a radio somewhere in the house, but it wasn't. It was the ghosts, well, maybe just ghost, one who'd learned a new trick while I thought I was beating him with my read until pass out strategy. He'd learned to murmur in the same low, deep voice, reverberating around my room night after night. By spring break, I was fully back to my old habit of staying up late, really late. My parents didn't know about my nighttime reading, or they'd have taken the flashlight away. They started sending me to bed earlier. This meant more talk, not scary but tense, filtering its way down the hall to my room. Reading became my guard against those late-night talks, too. My parents weren't the kind to always be arguing. It upset me to think of them being mad or mean to each other, making it harder to drift off on the couple of nights a week that my dad wasn't at work. But it wasn't just a voice that the ghost had learned. In my room, I noticed that things were moving around. Not little things either, big things like my dresser. which was heavy enough that even the two movers had been red-faced unloading it. It had been centered between my closet and the alcove as long as we'd lived there, but now it was pushed towards the alcove, not blocking it, but certainly casting more shadow over the opening at night. The marks of its sturdy legs were still pressed into the carpet where it had originally had sat. I brought it up at dinner, but my mom acted confused, and my father dismissed it as me misremembering my room. He looked tired, so I didn't argue. He had reasons to look tired, though. He was working longer hours, to my mind, to avoid the house. My mom seemed distracted. She was taking up hobbies that took her away, too. She started going to a book club and then a few nights a week leaving to help some friend with something. I should have been pleased. They were trusting me more and more, giving me more and more evenings without their supervision. But, of course, this was the opposite of what I wanted. Dad had longer hours and Mom had friends in book club, but I only had my one escape. The same night as I'd brought up my dresser, I awoke to hear the low voice again. I sat still, straining to try and make out what it was saying. It sounded like half of a conversation, the way one person would speak, wait, and then speak again. Was it the TV? It wasn't. We only had one TV, and it lived in the living room, on the wall opposite the French doors. If it was on, the light would be showing on my bedspread. Again, the tone of the voice wasn't angry, not like my parents' tones had been, sharp and rapid. It was slow. The tone was steady. I closed my eyes and drew my comforter over my head, hoping that sleep would come back. I think it did for a bit. When I opened my eyes again, the light in the room had grayed. I'd rolled onto my side and now faced the wall with the two small windows. It must have been early in the morning, just before sunrise, because they were still dark, just not full night dark. The low voice was gone. But there was something new. Something bad. I felt on guard, like I could tell something was eyeing me, watching me. Confused, I started to roll over onto my back, and as I did, I let my eyes sort of scan from windows to closet door to the opening of the alcove. And I froze, my heart at once lurching in my chest. There was a face in the alcove. A man's face, full and clean-shaven, seemed to float in the shadows of the alcove. I gaped. As my eyes cleared from sleep, I made out that he was pale, white, and had a faint body outline of neck and shoulders, but nothing else. Like one of those historical busts, but alive, floating in midair. And he was looking right at me. I opened my mouth to scream, to shout, but all I could wring from my soggy vocal cords was a weird squawk, not loud enough to bring my parents to my rescue. The face seemed to change. Its eyes grew in matching surprise. Its mouth started to open. I managed to fling the comforter back over my head again, and with that eye contact broken, I opened my mouth and I screamed. Not words, just the loudest sound I could make. I heard footsteps, creaks, and joints popping as my parents came running down the hallway to my room. But I stayed under the blanket, not wanting to lock eyes with the strange floating head in my room, or face it without the reassuring presence of my mom and dad. I heard the French doors open, and someone, my father judging by the grip, was pulling the blanket off from over my head. I lunged into them, feeling my dad's arms clasp around me, my eyes shut so tight I felt tears squeezing through them. My dad asked me what was wrong. It took me a few tries to get out that I'd seen a man's face in my room, staring at me, watching me for God knew how long. Where? Where was it? My words were sobs now. I couldn't say them clear enough for him to get it, so I forced my eyes open to point at it, already moving my arm to do so. And as I did, I saw that the face was gone. My dad followed my pointing and rushed to the closet. He flung open the doors and found Nothing, just clothes and toys. He turned to look into the alcove. From where he stood, he could see clearly into it, see past the few large pieces of furniture into the random pile of house clutter. Surely the head would be hiding there. But as he turned back, I could see on his face that he'd seen nothing amiss. No floating head, no oddly placed bric-a-brac that could have looked like a head in certain light. I was full on sobbing. My mom came in from behind my dad to hold me, telling me, "Shh, it's just a dream, kiddo. It's just a dream." She murmured it over and over, trying to comfort me as she called my father back to our side. My dad was agreeing with my mom. "There's nothing in the closet. What was it? What did you see?" I told them as best I could, but I could see on their faces that they'd already chalked it up to a nightmare. And that feeling, that my parents are always right feeling, had me half believing it too. I must have just dreamed it. And those words comforted me through the rest of the day. And when bedtime loomed, I continued to glance at the alcove from my book, checking and double-checking, my confidence growing every time I looked and saw nothing there. No floating face. It wasn't there the next night either, or the next. I never forgot about it. How could I forget that? But I thought about it less and less as time went on, and it didn't make a reappearance. All was quiet. All was calm. My parents' fights even seemed to hit a lull. At least. And then came the night in July. Bedtime had been at least an hour before, but it had taken me a while to wind down. I had just about gotten that heavy eyelid feeling that told me sleep was finally coming. My dad was, again, working late that night. He wasn't supposed to be home until dawn. Mom had retreated to her room shortly after dinner, saying she was halfway through a book and may call it a night early. She'd been eyeing me and feeling guilty about my little staying awake secret. The book comment was too close to home. I made myself scarce. But did I still grab a book that night and read to sleep? Yes. Yes, I did. And that night, I didn't quite get there. I was surprised to hear the metal shout of a truck door outside. It was my dad's truck. I knew its sounds as surely as I could pick out the old mint green truck in a parking lot. Good. That gave me some comfort, knowing my dad had gotten a surprise night off and would be in the house to protect us from the ghost. But then I heard another sound, and this sound was not my dad's truck. It was also not from outside. It was a voice. It was the low voice. More words this time. Like a dog craning its neck to hear a distant sound, I was turning my face towards where I seemed to hear it coming from, the alcove in the corner of my room. The light in the alcove was weird. I couldn't explain how, but it seemed less dark somehow. There was a pause, and that low voice came again, saying two words very clearly. "See you." I felt my skin prickle, my hair standing on end. I glanced to the windows, peering through them to make out the faintest glimpse of my dad's truck for reassurance. As I did, in my peripheral vision, I saw the light in the alcove dim again to its usual dark. Seeing the light actively change was both alarming, but with a shot of hope. Maybe the ghost had begun to appear, turning on its lights, so to speak, but at knowing my father was home, it thought better of it. Still, feeling my gut uncoil from my fright, I shifted my gaze back to the alcove, already taking a deeper breath to sigh in relief. A breath that caught in my throat like a bone, because the floating head was back. It wasn't blank, nor surprised at me like last time. It was angry, full of malice. I didn't dare breathe or blink, but this time my voice didn't stick. I screamed my head off. My dad must have been coming through the front door as I began shrieking, I heard the heavy thud of his boots running down the hall to the French doors before he flung them open. This time, Dad turned to flip on the light. The switch was between the French doors and the alcove, when he paused. I was already getting up to rush to him, but he turned away from me, entering the alcove instead. My mom entered next, began to move to hug me, but like my dad, I turned away as I followed my father, noticing what he had. The light in the alcove was weird again. As I stood behind him, I saw him look at the back wall of the alcove and then reach out a hand and push it. And a hidden door hinge swung the wall, which was, after I looked at it, the exact skinny tall size of all the other doors in the house. Out and into the back entrance hallway. We both looked down in the back entrance hallway, seeing at the same moment that the back door was slightly ajar. The whole time, my mom is pale-faced. I'm trying to grasp that this wasn't a ghost, but a real person. A burglar or a murderer who's been entering our home, watching me sleep, murmuring in that deep, low voice. My dad is as mad as I've ever seen him. He immediately tells Mom he's going to call the cops. But my mom is adamant that he shouldn't, saying that she must have left the back door open, and it looked like they were gone now. There was no point in calling. My dad was sputtering. Looks like they broke and entered. We have to make a report. What if they come back? What if I hadn't come home early tonight? Then what? My mom was firm, came right back at him with, if they came back, the door would be locked. And what exactly did my dad expect the cops to do except get the neighbors talking and scare me? She admitted he was right. It probably was just some homeless man. And did my dad expect that the police kept track of every homeless itinerant in the city? Well, my dad finally relented on her 4th or 5th promise to keep the doors locked. She made a big show of marching around to all of them, checking the locks as though to prove to him she could do it. When he told her, fine, he wouldn't call the cops, she huffed her way back to the bedroom, where I heard the door close, not gently. My dad lingered in my room, hands on hips, staring off into the alcove. He turned to me, this time intently asking what I had seen. I told him the same as last time, a floating man's face in the dark, the weird light, and the low voice. Could you tell what he was saying? My father was alert, and all I could tell him was something about seeing me before my eyes spilled over with hot tears. Well, the rest of that week, my dad didn't work any overtime. He even took off an extra couple of nights. He and I were sitting in the living room that Saturday, watching 5 minutes of sports for every 10 minutes of ads, it seemed like. Beside me, on one of the little end tables, the house landline phone rang. I picked it up and gave the greeting my parents taught me, Laughlin residence, and was just preparing to ask whom they wanted to speak to. But I didn't get a chance, because the voice interrupted. The voice. The low voice. My insides felt like a gallon of ice water had been thrown onto them. I hadn't heard what the voice said. By reflex was already asking what, but in my terror I just made pointless what sounds. My dad looked over at me and saw my expression. His eyes sharpened, and without a word he took the phone from me. Just as he began to bark, "Who is this?" I heard my mom's voice from down the hall. "Oh, I got it, hun. It's for me." A beat passed, and then another. My dad looked at me. I felt like I was falling, floating. The voice of my nightmares was calling my mom for a friendly chat. What was going on? I must have looked as scared as I felt. My dad asked me what was wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes from the phone in his hand. I don't know how or why I knew to whisper, but I told him, "That's the voice. From my room. From the alcove. The ghost." My father looked stricken, but he didn't question me further, not then. He put the phone down onto the cradle. He seemed to be thinking through something, turning it around in his mind. All at once he got up and turned to the hallway that led to their bedroom, calling to my mom. He told her we were going to the store. She was chipper and said to pick up some more onion powder or something like that while we were out. My dad looked at me, and I rose, following him to the front entryway and out to his truck. My dad drove us out to a little strip mall, a shopping plaza with a tailor's, a smoothie joint, and a tax preparation chain storefront all clustered together. He sat in the car with me a moment, and then told me he was going to go into that store, the tax preparation place. He told me, "See the front desk? I want you to watch. If you see..." And here he paused. I looked at him, thinking he was lost in thought, but his face wasn't pensive. He looked sad. In that stark midday light, I saw his face look carved, engraved with wrinkles and brackets. I'd never seen him look so sad. He finally continued, telling me that if I saw the man I'd seen in my closet, I needed to honk the horn twice. With that look on his face, I would have agreed to turn cartwheels down the sidewalk to make him smile again. So I said okay. He went in. The glass wasn't tinted, so it was easy to see the young blonde receptionist smile, then turn her head back to call someone in one of the little offices behind the long counter. I saw movement, someone approaching my dad, coming around the counter to shake his hand. It had been the lighting in the alcove after all. The head in my closet, it turned out, had a whole body and not just the shoulder part. He didn't look homeless either, not in a suit, hair combed back straight, smiling and greeting my dad like an old friend. But it was him. I honked twice. My dad took me, where else? To a donut shop. We sat there for a while. He bought me a donut, himself a styrofoam cup of coffee. Neither of us finished. I guess I expected to be relieved from what I learned that day. Maybe our house wasn't haunted. More importantly, I wasn't crazy or just seeing things. And if my mom and my dad knew him, then it wasn't a burglar or a murderer breaking into the house to watch me sleep. Just some guy who worked in an office, who knew my parents. But I still felt the same dread, because that day I learned we didn't live in a haunted house with an angry ghost who watched me sleep. I learned my mom had been cheating on my father with the husband of one of her friends. All those trips alone, those afternoons and evening errands had been her meeting up with him. The low voice in the house and the floating face, instances where she'd expected my dad to be working and me to be asleep. The floating face incidents were her panicking when she'd been startled or surprised by either my waking up or my dad being home when she didn't expect. In a panic, she had sent him to the alcove with the hidden door she'd discovered as she'd been the one to unpack the house. She had figured that he could hide there until the coast was clear and he could slip out the back door, as he'd done the second night I'd caught him. More to the point, I learned that Mom and Dad weren't absolutely right. That uncertainty spilling into my childhood innocence was equally as terrifying as the anger on the man's face had been, leering out at me from the shadows of my bedroom. Maybe he wasn't a murderer or a stranger, but he was a thief, because he stole my unexamined childhood sense that things were black and white, Mom and Dad were always right, and things would be okay all the time. He stole something else too. Sitting next to my father and seeing tears collecting in his eyes turned my donut to ash in my mouth. I haven't been able to eat one since. The terror of loss. Specifically, of thinking you could trust something. A stair under your feet. A friendship. A relative, a parent, a person in authority, and then finding out that you can't. I was told once that a lot of these stories tend to be less fantastic and more mundane. Well, a true monster in the closet story notwithstanding, I think it's somehow more scary when something you fear can come from something so humble and commonplace. Of course, that might be because I have a recurring nightmare about the DMV, but maybe not. If you have a story you'd like to share, social media and email are in the description. Liking, commenting, and subscribing may do something for YouTube, but absolutely does something for me. I see every one of them, and I appreciate the heck out of you guys for it. And that's why you'll find me here again next Tuesday with another broadcast. Until then, stay strange, stay safe, and please take care, strangers.